I'm Brinton Likes, and as Dan mentioned last night, co-director with him of the Center for Human Rights and International Justice. And we are delighted to have all of you here today at Boston College, both to enjoy a delightful day when you have an opportunity to be outside, but more particularly to engage with us in what we hope will be a dynamic dialogue around structural racism in the United States and how we engage the interstices of migration, indigenous peoples' rights, and legacies of settler colonialism. We were delighted to have had a wonderful talk last night that launched this conversation and some wonderful questions in which people were beginning to interrogate different ways to think about how we redress these injustices, and we look forward to many more conversations today. As many of you know, our impetus for convening this gathering is our ongoing commitment to exploring the nature, the history, the legal, institutional, and societal instantiations of structural racism, with a particular focus on 3 sites in which it plays out in the United States. The Center for Human Rights and International Justice is an interdisciplinary, activist scholarship center and has sought to invite scholars from a variety of disciplines who focus on these historical relationships and on ongoing crises. How should we understand these intersectional claims in light of centuries of imperialism, exploitation, forced occupation, armed conflict, patriarchal violence, white supremacy, among other catastrophes, including of the climate, and ongoing massive violations of human rights? So this day is an effort to bring us together to think about these issues, to explore them more deeply, but to focus ourselves on actions, activities, and activism that we can generate. So we have among us today scholars, advocates, and activists, and we're delighted to have you with us, recognizing the limits of one short day of conversations. I hope you've picked up a program. If you haven't, they're on the table outside. And you will be reminded that the day has been organized into 3 different panel presentations, one focused on indigenous issues, one focused on reparations and redress of demands of African American communities, and the third one focused on complex issues that are being articulated by migrants/immigrants into the United States and into other countries of the northern globe. We also will have a final panel discussion trying to pull these issues together, trying to identify silences, absences, topics that weren't well developed in the conversations during the day. And we invite all of you to stay with us during this time and to participate in these activities.
I'm an Afro-Indigenous and I'm Saginaw Chippewa. My great-grandmother, Esther Shaboose Mays, traveled to Detroit, Michigan in the spring of 1940, and shortly thereafter married an African-American male. She got a lot of hate from Detroit's Indigenous community, especially men, for doing so. But as one of my Indigenous mentors, Dr. George Cornell, told me as a sophomore at Michigan State, your grandma didn't take shit from nobody. Her activism centered on the future of children. She co-founded what was called Detroit's Indian Education and Cultural Center in 1974. She also dragged her children to these spaces as well, culminating 20 years later in her daughter, my Aunt Judy, founding the 3rd ever public school with an indigenous curriculum in Detroit called Medicine Bear American Indian Academy. I mention this story often not simply because of how proud I am of my family's legacy, but the importance of creating spaces where we can all be and relate to one another. The school had Afro-Indigenous children, children with multiple Indigenous heritages, both from the First Nations in the US and Canada, and many other identities. But let me now turn to the topic at hand. The questions that undergird my approach and analysis are simple. What is the relationship between Blackness and indigeneity? What has been the impact of settler colonialism, white supremacy, and racial capitalism on Black and Indigenous peoples? And what kind of world do we want to build in the aftermath of settler colonialism and white supremacy? And I'm assuming everyone thinks those are bad. Can y'all raise your hand at the very least, right? White supremacy is bad, settler colonialism is at least bad. All right. Well, I'm glad we're on the same page about that. but you can't make assumptions either. Black women have produced some of the most important ideological work in the post-war era, including Black feminist thought and intersectionality. The centrality to Black women to understanding oppression and imagining possibilities for ending it has been foundational to our thoughts on race, gender, and solidarity. The women of the Combahee River Collective were a key component of that. Of the many jewels argued in that piece, one of my favorites is, and perhaps controversial in some instances, although it's not really considered, when Black women are free, all people will be free. In other words, if we center the experiences of oppression experienced by Black women, then all forms of justice will end. Black activists, including the Movement for Black Lives Matter today, have carried forward this activist ideology. Indeed, in co-founder of the Black Lives Matter movement, Alicia Garza's memoir, she asserts that when Black people are free, all people will be free. Obviously, I support Black liberation. And y'all are down for Black liberation, yeah? I hope so. Okay, there we go. That should be without resistance in this society. And yet I wonder, where does land fit into this equation? My aim is not to create conflict or to dismiss the importance of Black freedom, but even if Black people receive liberation tomorrow, it doesn't resolve the question of indigenous land and who can make claims to that land. As we move toward the aftermath of settler colonialism and white supremacy, we need to critically interrogate the meaning of justice, freedom, and reparatory justice, without basing our analysis on the ideas that the foundations of racial capitalism, settler colonialism, and U.S. democracy as structures rooted in the enslavement of Africans and the dispossession of indigenous peoples and their afterlives. By conjoining these experiences of Black and indigenous peoples and the quest for liberation, we broaden the scope of possibilities. In other words, justice in the move towards justice, for example, reparations, we must think creatively and judiciously as possible regarding Black freedom and its relationship to indigenous sovereignty. The person who had this right is Stokely Carmichael, who had changed his name to Kwame Ture. Y'all know who Stokely Kwame Ture is, right? Okay. I was glad to hear Professor Saito mention Ture last night, but I want to quote a speech he gave in St. Paul, Minnesota in 1975, where he remarked, quote, "Anybody who thinks seriously about working on behalf of the red man must deal with this truth. The land on which we live, on which we inhabit, that land belongs to the red man. He must come first in any dealings with the land," end quote. And so that is a duty of Black people too, center the land. However, Black liberation does not necessarily equal liberation for all, including indigenous peoples, nor does it equal to the liberation of land. The Republic of New Africa is one example, founded in Detroit in 1968. They call for the 5 southern states as reparations for slavery. But we must ask, what about the indigenous peoples, the 5 tribes who were forcibly removed? Certainly they owe some form of reparations to the descendants of people they enslaved and can at least incorporate them as citizens. I live in Los Angeles, California. Anyone been to LA? Shout out LA. Although the weather here is great today. Shocking. And there's current legislation to offer reparations for African Americans who can demonstrate that they have an ancestor who was enslaved in the 19th century. I suppose they want every Black person to get their genealogical research on, like where Alex Haley, the author of Roots. Anyways, one of the recommendations from the report is to, quote, create forms of expression, acknowledgement, and remembrance of the trauma of state-sanctioned white supremacist terror, possibly including memorials and funding a long-term Truth and Reconciliation Commission, end quote. One example is a case of the Bruce's family who owned Bruce's Beach, which is now called Manhattan Beach. The city council in 1925 decided to take that land unilaterally. The beach is worth millions now. While this is a tragedy of dispossession and theft, and I support the Bruce family descendants getting compensated, it says nothing about returning land to indigenous peoples of Tongva who were dispossessed first. Again, I'm not interested in competition, but a true notion of justice. I support truth and reconciliation, but what about the indigenous peoples, which means the return of land? We must return to the land. We should think broadly about reparations. As Oluwefin and Taiwo argues, quote, but slavery, colonialism, and the political structure they produce were in our global phenomena, end quote. If they were global and large in scale, we must connect and think through Black and indigenous liberation. Land back is the unequivocal idea meant to return indigenous peoples' land. As the Indian Collective, a group of indigenous organizers from Turtle Island to Palestine, argue, quote, to truly dismantle white supremacy and systems of oppression, we have to go back to the roots, which for us is putting indigenous lands back in indigenous hands, end quote. Land is key. Without the land and rethinking how we relate, we aren't going to achieve even a modicum of liberation. The Indian collective further articulates a vision of co-liberation by suggesting that land back, quote, is a political framework that allows us to deepen our relationships across the field of organizing movements working towards true collective liberation. It allows us to envision a world where Black, Indigenous, and people of color liberation coexist. The idea of coexisting, co-liberation, and collective freedom for some Indigenous peoples might be scary, seem unfair, perhaps even unnecessary. These folks view the world through what I call the lens of the late great Vine Deloria Jr., who opined in 1978, quote, minority groups are often astounded to learn that the Indians were not planning to share the continent with their oppressed brothers once the revolution was over. Hell no. The Indians are planning on taking the continent back and kicking out all the Black, Chicano, Anglos, and Asian brothers who had made the whole thing possible, end quote. I understand this sentiment, especially for the time. Indigenous voices and perspectives on justice were ignored for years during this era, and many times remain so. However, I tend to fall in line with the Anishinaabe intellectual and writer Leanne Simpson, who, writing in the aftermath of the uprising in Ferguson, Missouri, notes, quote, to me, Ferguson is a call to not only indict the system, but to decolonize the systems that create and maintain the forces of indigenous genocide and anti-Blackness. I have a responsibility to make space in my land for those communities of struggle, to center and amplify Black voices, and to coexist, end quote. I'll end here with thinking about kinship as solidarity. The work of solidarity for our collective futures requires a rethinking of how we relate. But as queer Black feminist Audre Lorde reminds us, quote, any future vision which can encompass all of us by definition must be complex and expanding, not easy to achieve. In other words, the relationship between all of us is not necessarily something that is going to be easy for any sort of liberation. We're not natural allies. I want to say that again. Just because you're oppressed, it does not mean that we're natural allies. It sounds kind of strange to say that out loud. Y'all with me there? Right. It takes a lot of work for liberation. I propose that we consider kinship as solidarity. In my own tribe, the Saginaw Chippewa, and many other nations, they have a clan system that tells you how you relate to other people and non-human species and the land, which ultimately defines not only your relationship to people, but your responsibility. What if tribal nations, in exercising their sovereignty, began incorporating, for example, African Americans into their nations using the clan system, right? So we have different, so I belong to the B.E.A.R clan or Makwado Dim, and there are different ways you relate and your responsibilities to that. And they even created one for what you might call, vaguely speaking, outsiders. We can quibble about resources, et cetera, but none of us can live together on this land in a just way without kinship. If sovereignty means anything, it must include our bodies, our knowledge systems, and the ability to regenerate, quote, indigenous languages, philosophies, legal systems, and intellectual systems to nurture and continue those systems for the land, end quote. Again, land is key. Chimigwich, thank you. Ooh.
I was just thinking about, what is accountability, and really how do we have truth and reconciliation with each other and all races of people here, recognizing that race itself was a construct that doesn't mean anything. It was invented to keep a certain structure in place and to make sure that a certain race of people were able to claim domination over everyone else and superiority, which we still hear today. As white nationalism in the government, a lot of the problems still exist exactly. And when people talk about going back to 1776, we know what they're talking about. Because in 1776, the Constitution said that only white men could own anything. Only they could vote. And you hear a lot of that rhetoric. I hear it. I'm not, it's like you've got to be under a rock not to understand what all that means. But what's important is to recognize the premise from which it comes. And when I think about that, I think about the 1492 and all the way through 1493 decrees from the popes in Rome that said that you could take anybody's land if they weren't Christian. Of course, African, Australian, and Americas, we were not Christian. And so they said you could take all your land because you were barbarous and you absolutely could not, take good care of the land. So when Columbus came here and he went back, the Portuguese government gave him permission under the guise of creating a Christian empire. And even today, you hear people talk about that. Some of our illustrious senators speak about wanting this to be a Christian country. And so that's what they're really saying, is they want to go back to a time when white people were completely in power. That's how I hear that. And so how can you have truth and reconciliation with that? Well, fortunately, a lot of people don't buy into it. And especially Indigenous people recognize it. And we recognize all the ways in which our land was taken. I was thinking about, how property has been dealt with differently over time. And, taking of the land is really important. And how can you repair that for Indigenous people? You cannot. What you can do, though, is make it not owned by anyone. And we actually believe that that's the way to go, is to find a way to make the land not owned by anyone. It's the only way for equity to happen, and it could be done if it's put in trust, or if it's Indigenous people are thinking about all these different ways. And we're trying to use the eminent domain as a way of recapturing our land, because the way in which the government has used that has been disingenuous, to say the least. They changed from whether it's for public good or whether you're benefiting a wealthy individual corporation. Like, it became really kind of interesting in New London when there was a case, this woman named Kalo, she had a house that she owned from 1918, and now we're in a good neighborhood. But now they wanted to claim it through eminent domain for some other development to happen there. But when that happened, people began to look at the whole issue of eminent domain in a different way. So a lot of people are really upset to think that you could take your home. Any of our homes could be taken. That's just the way it is. Because if they say that there's a better good to be used for your land, they can come and take it. It happened on Indian land when someone tried to put a helicopter pad. And even the tribal governments have a form of eminent domain where they have it. But the unique thing about Indigenous is that no matter how you slice it, the U.S. government and the states have the final say. So it's not the same as when the government claims eminent domain. There is no one to contest that. You can go to court, but you will never win with that. Whereas the tribal governments, the government can come in and just nix what you just did. But nonetheless, it is a tool of resistance, and it's a tool to take back land. Like, there's a lot of land being returned to Native peoples right now. And we're looking for ways not to recreate this system. Like, how could you get this land and not have it owned by an individual, but more collectively run? And then for that, you would really need to have a means of resolving conflict. You would have to have a means of making it sustainable for your community. Through the land, collective ownership of it, you could actually find a way to have people not be part of the mainstream economy. You could begin to take back your own economy. These are the ways in which we're looking at these things. But this takes a different mindset. And even among Indigenous people, we've been colonized. So it's hard to, really wrap your mind around shifting that way of looking at the world. So what we did at the Visioning B.E.A.R Circle and at the Tribal Coalition is we recognize that none of the systems really work for our communities, nor do we see it working for Black communities either. We started out inside of a mainstream domestic violence sexual assault agency, and we found that none of our people were coming there because there was the issue of taking people out of their homes, there was the issue of children being placed in a culture not their own, in white foster care. So we worked on dealing with all those things. And then we found we really couldn't continue to work in the agency because they didn't have a perspective on restoring things to wholeness. They didn't have a restorative aspect. Now, mind you that Native peoples have had a means of addressing the harm person doing the harm is the most key person that you needed to address, because harm will not change, violence will not change unless those folks are healed. So we do that work nationally now, and we try to keep it out of the police department, which is hard, because the police department wants ownership even over restorative justice. So there really is no restorative justice. We worked on the Restorative Justice Advisory Committee here in Massachusetts, and for a while there we had a big impact, especially after George Floyd. We really tried to work on getting people to look at how they saw justice and to recognize that the judicial system is a part of the problem. They set the oppressive laws that we all have to live with, and most especially people of color are oppressed by, and we are the ones that occupy the prisons mostly. So getting them to look at that was something else, and getting them to think about having a circle where all the voices are heard. We got a couple of things that we were able to do with that, but ultimately they reverted back because the legislature doesn't have to go by their advisory committees. They can do what they want. And so they made that clear to us. And they got frustrated with what we were talking about. We wanted them to address what happened to Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and George Floyd as to informing the work. And so that didn't really happen. So we had a circle about it. I led the circle. It come around. No one spoke of the issue. So I said, please accept my resignation. I didn't want to spend any more time there. And that was a decision well made, because I don't regret it. And, you know, the way we structure our organizations is critically important. Like at Visioning B.E.A.R, we have a board that meets in circle. Everyone gets paid the same in our agency, no matter what it is you do. And all people that are participatory, they get to have a vote in any decision that we make that involves them. That's a critical difference. It was a lot of thought on our part. And also, to decolonize, you really need to look at the original instructions. That takes a long time. The original instructions are the first human being that came, and Indigenous people believe in a common ancestor for us all. And that when that ancestor came, there were already plants and animals here. And those plants and animals, they have the same rights. In fact, they had a pact with what we call Geminado, or the creator, or whatever name you want to call it, the first, the reason why we're all here in this mysterious way, that they made an agreement with Geminado that they would take care of us. And so they have. They taught us about food. They taught us about medicine. They taught us about how to live in respect. They taught us reciprocity. They taught us to have respect for the animals and plants that feed them. Somehow or other, the colonial system made that all an object, because once money got into the picture, everything got objectified. All the plants, the animals, became cash crops. People became cash crops. People became exploitable. That's a philosophy, and that's a way of looking at the world. So we teach the difference. And then they call it the 7 grandfather teachers, but we didn't even know that when we started out. What we knew is that we needed to re-indigenize, so we went back and looked at what the values were. It took us 2.5 years to figure it out, and then once we figured it out, we realized it was already there in the teaching lodges. And it was wonderful to figure it out for ourselves. And then to recognize that these values are that everything you do has to come from love, even if you're dealing with a conflict and you're angry, and even if you've been abused, you need to look at love and compassion as your way forward. And then to have respect for everything, the plants, the animals, as equitable relations. And then to have the bravery to speak out about these issues when you see that they're not being done in a good way. And then to have that courage to speak out, and then to have a balance in your life around, not working yourself to the bone, recognizing that we were put here to really enjoy creation. We were put here to be able to be with the plants and animals and the wonder of that. We were put here to realize our visions. We were put here for bringing our medicine into the world and for making sure that all our children got to be fully who they are. This is what we were put here for. And then we were put here to be humble, to recognize that we're not the top of the food chain, that we're part of a web of incredible creation. Then we were put here to have like the capacity for empathy, to be able to put yourself in the shoes. We did a vision quest in New Braintree by the largest white oak tree in New England at the time. And the second day when we woke up, this tree loved us. We felt that love. It was different, but it's possible. And our children need to know that these relationships are possible. This is critical, because if a tree can be talking to you, if a tree can love you, you got no business chopping it down for no good reason. Like, we had a respect for the environment. Someone needs to ask us how it is that we were here for 10,000 years without wrecking the planet. How it was that we were here when we had reproductive control. You know, really, Native peoples had control of our own bodies to the extent that we could decide if we would have children at all. We could decide what sex that child would be. And we could decide, you know, everything through our knowledge of plants, that we had the capacity to do that. And the Shoshone really taught me that when I did a lot of teaching there, that these were knowledge that we all had. And somehow that knowledge had been taken out of us through colonization. And so we even need to redo these things. And, you know, many of my Black and Indigenous folks that have taken and participated in our training begin to take hold of all of these things. A lot of the folks have been forced to say they're Black or to say they're Indigenous by each of our groups. But the key is that you need to reconcile and claim all of yourself, all of your ancestors. Why deny any of them? It's like you're fuller with all of them. And it's a way to bridge gaps, to understand that we're all impacted. And in me, I have white ancestors, some I'm quite proud of. One of our ancestors is actually related to Gil directly, and Gil was a young boy who grew up in the Abenaki territory in New Hampshire, and he became the first white Abenaki chief. And of course, he married a native peoples, and so that's part of my ancestry. And my ancestry goes back to the first folks that were here in Nova Scotia when the French first came. But these things that we need to claim, because we have 7 generations in our DNA. And so I'm proud of that white person that's in my life. And I actually love all the white parts of myself, too. I love all of myself. And like you see, I cross my pronouns, but none of them fit for me. Like Agma is the term we would use in Abenaki land. In our tribe, we use Agma. Agma is they. So, but Agma is not, and like I didn't grow up with the luxury of these pronouns, so I often, doing it right now, switch back and forth. But I'm a two-spirit. So I guess I could speak from either one, you know, it's like, but it's all in one person, that's the thing. And like the Agma recognizes that you're one single person. Because when I use we and I talk about we and I have a partner, a wife, you know, and like if I say we, they think we're both sick. If I say we are sick, so we can't come, they think we're both sick, so it's problematic. But anyway, I'm probably going over how
Yeah.
I am, so I should.
Need to wrap it up. Yeah.
And I've not really touched upon most of anything, but I think environmental justice is key for us, reproductive rights, all of it's connected. I hope this really resonates with all of you, and thank you, Chimigwich.
Very much.
Ujuani. So yeah, I'm Matthew Fletcher, and it's really awesome to be able to come out here to Boston to sit on a panel and hear people talk about the Anishinaabe principles and histories that I know so well. This is the Wabanaki land, the land of the dawn. The sun comes over the east, and Kyle and I come from Anishinaabe Waki, which is the Great Lakes area, where the Anishinaabe people are, but listening to Strong O talk, it's some of the same words that we use and hold dear in our own language in the Western Great Lakes are very similar. The name for creator, slightly pronounced differently, is the same. The name for leader is also very similar. So I'll start with that. And it's a real pleasure to be able to hear these words. And I know our ancestors would be proud. So I'm the lawyer of this crew, and I was looking at the list of terms that are in panel number 1, and I guess I'm the survivance guy. And with all apologies to Gerald Visner, another Shinab, I really, really hate that word, but we'll leave it at that. I'll be the survivance guy today. What is survivance? It's living in a system of unrelenting horror and evil and not dying, and actually, in some cases, to a limited extent, thriving. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with a parable of sorts. In Anishinaabe, we would say it's an Adazokan, a sacred story. And most sacred stories are completely made up. They come back from generations, from time immemorial. This one happened about 15 years ago. I call it the parable, I just made this up, the parable of the baby octopus. So I'm a citizen of the Grand Traverse Band of Ottawa and Chippewa Indians, and in Michigan, that's right here where this little finger is, right? It's on the Leonal Peninsula, and the crook of the Grand Traverse Bay is a town called Traverse City. And just outside of Traverse City, on the eastern shore of the Grand Traverse Bay, my tribe owns lands there. And about 15, maybe closer to 20 years ago now, but more like 15, the tribe put in an application to take land into trust. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit, what that means. And it's nice to hear you talk about trust land. So one of the things you have to do if you're a tribe trying to tell the federal government and persuade the federal government to acquire land in trust for you and turn it into reservation land to restore the homeland is that you have to go to all of the community around where the trust land is going to be and persuade them too. Because the decision to take land into trust is inherently a political decision. So most of the time, nobody really cares all that much. Grand Traverse Band has had a lot of land over the years taken into trust. Sometimes there are objections. Those objections are responded to, and then they kind of just float away. And this was one of those situations. So I'm going to tell you the outcome right now. We got our land into trust, but it took more than 10 years. It shouldn't take that long. So we had a community hearing. My brother, who is then the general counsel for the tribe, his name is Zeke. Zeke was the tribe's representative at the community hearing in a township called Acme Township. And I always love Acme Township. It's where the coyote always orders stuff from that breaks and blows up in his face. That's Acme Township. Acme Township had this hearing, and a fair number of people showed up, and some of them had objections, and most of them actually stood up and said, it's been 20-some years since the tribe was reaffirmed as a federally acknowledged tribe. In that time, they've become one of the leading employers in the region. A bunch of money that tribe has generated from the casinos has gone back into the schools of the area. And so there were people who were there to support the tribe's application to take land into trust. There was one objector who handed out a piece of paper. And she said that when the tribe in the 70s was poor and destitute, had 12.5 acres of land. There were only a few hundred people living in Beshabi Town. They were functionally homeless in northern Michigan, living in tar paper shacks with newspaper as insulation, no running water, no electricity, no services at all. People's houses burned down all the time. It was the worst situation you can imagine. It was worse than Pine Ridge. I'm sorry for Pine Ridge, but Beshabi Town was worse than that. She said, I remember those days, and I was in support of the tribe acquiring land into trust and getting back on its feet. And she said, the tribe then was kind of like a baby octopus. They were cute and harmless, and they weren't going to cause any trouble. But now they're a large, full-grown octopus, and they have their huge tentacles around our community, and they are squeezing us until they will take all of our land, and we will be without anything. And I wasn't at that meeting. But the lady handed out a piece of paper. My brother came, sent it to me. By this time, I was a law professor. And so I have it still in my possession somewhere, the parable of the baby octopus. And he showed it to me, and he said, what do you think of this? And I said, this lady is absolutely right. That's exactly what we're going to do. And it's not going to happen this year. It's not going to happen in the next century. but it is going to happen. And sorry, but we're coming for the land. And if you ever hear the phrase land back, that's what this is about. But I've identified for you the fringes of a legal problem. And since I'm the lawyer, let me talk to you a little bit about the legal problem. The legal problem is this. There is a federal law that says the Secretary of the Interior can, at the Secretary's absolute discretion, acquire land into trust for Indian tribes. This is a statute passed in 1934. It is a remedial or reform statute designed to allow the federal government to help Indian tribes restore their land base. Almost all of Indian lands in the latter half of the 19th and early 20th century were basically taken, dispossessed through an allotment policy and other things. And my tribe, Grand Traverse Band, and other tribes in Michigan were no exception to this. So this statute is designed to allow the federal government to basically acquire land, put it in a trust status, and restore it effectively to reservation status. It's a restoration of our land. It's land back. The federal government doesn't like to do this because it costs money. So what tribes have begun to do, really since the 1980s, is buy land and then give it to the Secretary of the Interior, free of title, everything. It belongs to the United States government. And then the Secretary, through this one law, will take the land into trust, and then it becomes our reservation land. It's a really weird thing that you're giving land to your colonizer, but that's what we do. I guess that's survivance. You can tell this is one of the reasons I don't like that word. But that's what we do. That's what lawyers do. That's what tribal leaders do. This is a thing that almost all the tribes strive for, is to buy land with our own cash and give it to the United States so then we can use it as reservation land. The problem here, the legal problem here, is that it's discretionary. So the Secretary, if the Secretary wants to, can take the land into trust, or the Secretary can decline to take the land into trust. And mostly what they do is they just don't act on an application. And so that's what they did for us with this particular parcel of land for 10 years, until we complained a lot and went to Congress, and eventually the Secretary took land into trust. Note, during the period of time that we were doing the application, it was a Republican administration, and that's one kind of administration that does not like to take land into trust unless you pay them. The Indian tribes have to bribe the Republican Party, literally, to take land into trust. We have to kind of do that too with the Dems, but they like to feel good about themselves more often than the Republicans do, so they'll just do it sometimes without us bribing them. But this is politics. But the legal problem is, what if the government declines to act on your application, or just outright declines to take your land into trust? Well, if they decline, you can at least say, hey, you made a decision and we can sue you and force you to do something. But even then, the courts will say, when the federal government has discretion, when the Secretary of the Interior has discretion, we as a court cannot tell them what to do. So this is a legal problem, and we all try to come up with solutions. So in the next 4 minutes, I will tell you that broad outlines of my solution. And it's not just about fee to trust. It's about pretty much everything, because the Secretary of the Interior, other federal agencies can, if they want to, do things that are helpful to Indian tribes and Indian people around the country, around the world. Most of the time, they choose not to. We're finally, in the last half century or so, by the way, in a position where the majority of the time, they don't go out of their way to do terrible things to tribes anymore. So thumbs up for that. But they don't do a lot to help Indian tribes either. And actually, they're supposed to. So my paper, and you don't see this in the headline, I changed the name of it from this. It's called The Dark Matter of Federal Indian Law. Dark matter is, I'm not really sure what it is, because nobody knows what it is. But apparently there's all this matter in the universe. It's supposed to be X. And scientists can only see about 30% of it. And so they say there's supposed to be a whole bunch more matter, and we can't see it yet. And we theorize that it's there, but it's invisible. So that's about 70% of the universe is something we cannot see it. The scientists can't see it. I can't see it. Everything I can see is right here in this room. But so I think that's a good metaphor for federal Indian law. For example, the very fact that the United States signed a treaty under its constitution with an Indian tribe is an implied acknowledgement that that tribe is a sovereign entity. You don't sign treaties with the Boy Scouts or Microsoft or state governments even. You only sign treaty with other sovereign nations, and that's an Indian tribe. So they did that for a long time. That's an implicit acknowledgement. It doesn't really say that in the treaty. It just says, we signed a treaty, here's a bunch of Indians, they agree to this stuff, haha, suckers. Then, but it's an acknowledgement to this day that those tribes, the signatories, are actually federally acknowledged sovereign entities. And that's really important. From there, all sorts of things follow from that. That is part of the dark matter of our treaty, effectively, of federal Indian law. So the thing is that Indian tribes, my tribe in particular, sold so many millions of acres of land, about 1/3 of the entire land base of the state of Michigan, and got a couple $100,000 for it. When we litigated in the Indian Claims Commission, they said it's about 12.5 cents an acre. Right. And even in 1836, it was worth more than 12.5 cents an acre. And you can only imagine what it was worth now. And they clear cut everything, every single piece of timber, old growth timber, stuff that's probably worth hundreds of billions of dollars. And just pick a number, that's how much it's worth, and then double it, okay? So we did not get the benefit of the bargain. And you learn in contracts class, a contract, an agreement between two entities, even two sovereigns, has to have some sort of equivalency. I think in those treaties, those agreements, there is dark matter that we don't know about yet. And one of the things that we know that comes out of treaties about the relationship between Indian tribes and the United States, we usually call it the trust responsibility. And the lawyers call it the general trust responsibility. That means that the United States owes an obligation to Indian tribes and Indian people. They don't really know what it is, but every time Congress does something, they're enforcing the general trust responsibility. That's a good thing. It's constitutional. When they refuse to do something, it's discretion, and the courts won't make them do that. The only way we can make them do it is through the political process, and we do okay in some way, in respects in the 21st century. But I think there's an obligation, because we gave up millions and millions of acres of land and a bunch of other things external to that, external sovereignty of the tribes and a bunch of other things as well. They took our kids too, by the way, goddammit. And so there is a lot the United States owes. So my theory is, and I'll stop right here, the discretion that the federal government claims to own and has in its infinite wisdom or choice to do something or not to do something is no discretion at all. And actually legally is an obligation. And if you want to know what that means as a lawyer, the place to look to, and I can't even get to this because I'm down to 14 minutes, is, at least in the event that nobody says anything in an act of Congress, is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
So I'm not going to let you stop there, Matthew,
Okay.
because you didn't count your time right. And plus, we have a little more time from Carl as well. So I'd love to hear you elaborate on the UN Declaration and its impact on the trust responsibility.
Well, I'd be happy to do that. Kristen says that Jim and I kind of came up with this first, so I'll have to give him some props to start off with. But the theory basically is this. The Declaration of the Declaration is sort of the 21st century understanding under international customary law what the relationship is that we call the duty of protection between a superior sovereign and an inferior sovereign. It's like a baseline set of rules. So if one sovereign, the United States, takes another sovereign under its protection, Indian tribes, that's called the trust responsibility usually in the modern era. But originally it was called the duty of protection, way back in the day. The treaties actually say the U.S. takes this tribe under its protection. That is a invocation of customary international law where you have something known as the duty of protection, i.e. the trust responsibility. So at the founding or throughout the 19th century when treaties were being negotiated, whatever the international understanding at that time was of the duty of protection is sort of the background haze of every treaty, of every arrangement between the United States and Indian tribes. So fast forward to the 2020s, now we have UNDRIP, which is sort of the modern understanding, and eventually it will stop being modern, but the modern understanding what the baseline duty of protection is between any sovereign entity and indigenous peoples who are under its protection, so to speak. And so the United States has passed a bunch of statutes. They're mostly collected in Title 25 of the U.S. Code, which on the side of it says Indians, so that's how you know how to find it. That's sort of like the United States implementation at this point of its duty of protection to Indian tribes. The Indian treaties are also part of that, but I already told you those Indian treaties are like big giant gaps more than anything. So there are still gaps in Title 25, which is 5 books long. And there are lots of places, usually places like discretion, or just where the United States has not acted, where there are gaps, where we don't really know what the outcome of a particular dispute is going to be. Where the U.S. for example, the U.S. could say, when a tribe does a certain kind of business activity, that means it's immune from suit or not, or it means it can be taxed or not, or something to that effect. There are just so many gaps in the law. UNDRIP to fill that gap. So you look to the United Nations Declaration, try to figure out, using some of these broad principles, how the dispute where Congress and Indian tribes have not reached an arrangement, where that dispute should head in what direction. Now, UNDRIP itself is pretty vague as well. And the U.S. already, in some respects, the Supreme Court and the federal judiciary already has tools at its disposal, what I call the default rules of interpretation, the canons of construction for interpreting Indian treaties, federal statutes, also things like what we call the clear statement rules. Indian tribes retain inherent sovereignty unless Congress explicitly strips those tribes of those powers, things like that. Those are legal terms, law stuff. But that UNDRIP is, in theory, should be able to fill the gaps where you have a legal dispute that isn't explicitly decided by an act of Congress or an Indian treaty or some other agreement involving an Indian tribe.